The day began innocently enough, with Lady Chronotis returning from her first journey in her newly modified Type 40 TARDIS. There was laughter, teasing, and the usual banter of the High Council. Lord Darkfire welcomed Lady Chronotis back from her travels, while Lord Serpentine questioned the details of her TARDIS. Lord President Chronotis admitted that he and Lady Chronotis had been away from Gallifrey, and Lord Serpentine reminded them that plenty had happened in their absence. Yet beneath the light-hearted conversation there were already hints that something was not quite right. Lord President Chronotis reaffirmed that Gallifrey would remain out of otherworldly affairs unless a direct threat emerged, with Lord Darkfire's agents responsible for bringing such threats to his attention. The investigator agreed that from a legal standpoint this was the proper course of action. Lord President Chronotis then brought the council to the real matter at hand. Workers had been reinforcing the ancient caves in the Outlands when a wall collapsed, revealing something unexpected, an ancient passageway. The council would have the first opportunity to discover what lay beyond. The only problem, as Lord President Chronotis dryly pointed out, was that Lady Chronotis had chosen to arrive wearing heels. Lady Chronotis looked down at her shoes, sighed, and accepted that the budget would simply have to provide her with a new pair. With torches distributed by Lord Serpentine, night vision goggles produced by Lord Conundrum, and several questionable suggestions involving robots and K9 units, the group began their descent. The journey itself was almost an adventure before the real adventure had begun. There were stairs, there were far too many stairs. Lady Chronotis complained about them, while Professor Canis suggested perhaps they should have even packed a picnic. Eventually, they reached the structure revealed by the collapsed wall. The investigator volunteered to go first, and the group cautiously approached the entrance. There were jokes about treasure maps, falling rocks, and Indiana Jones-style traps, but eventually the first chamber appeared safe, or at least safe enough to continue. Beyond the entrance lay a narrow walkway suspended above an enormous drop. Lady Chronotis immediately recommended that everyone cross one at a time. The investigator went first and soon announced the bridge was safe. Lord Serpentine followed, with Lady Chronotis following behind. She clung nervously to the wall and made it very clear that heights and spiders were not among her favourite things. The rest of the group crossed with no incident. Then they found the first clue, a strange sigil of a tree. Lord Darkfire studied it and quietly wondered if it might represent the Tree of Life. The investigator recognised the same symbolism. Professor Canis asked Lord Conundrum to scan the carving and estimate its age, but the readings proved inconclusive. The symbol was undeniably old, but exactly how old remained a mystery. The group pressed onward. Lord Darkfire used his technology to scan the next area for traps, but the results could not completely rule out primitive mechanisms. The investigator volunteered to enter first and once again returned with reassuring words that it was safe. Beyond the passage, however, was something beautiful. Strange lights glowed overhead, illuminating an ancient cavern. Lady Chronotis set upward in wonder, while Professor Canis wondered if the lights were being powered by some form of crystal energy. Lord Winters, naturally, began imagining the cavern as an excellent location for a Greek restaurant. Yet beauty soon gave way to something far stranger. They entered a room untouched by time. Dust covered everything. It lay thick upon every surface, suggesting that thousands of years had passed since anyone had entered. And yet there was no decay, no rust, no crumbling stone, and no shattered glass. Nothing appeared damaged. Everything simply appeared to be waiting. Lord Darkfire discovered a visitor registry, while Lady Chronotis brushed dust from the counter. Lord Winters wondered if they had stumbled upon a legendary lost chapter house. The investigator noticed that the clocks had stopped. Then Lord President Chronotis touched a teapot and made a discovery that changed everything. The tea was still warm. The room should have been ancient. The dust said it was ancient, the silence said it was ancient, yet the tea had not gone cold. Lady Chronotis immediately pointed out the impossibility of it all. There were no fresh footprints, no signs of recent activity, and no disturbance apart from their own. Professor Canis suggested that perhaps the room had been preserved within a time loop. Lord Serpentine discovered the Great Seal, while the investigator noticed something even stranger. The diplomatic seals were only partly Gallifreyan, the other half were completely unknown. Then Lord Darkfire examined the visitor registry more carefully. The names Lord President Kayla and Lady Marina Sen appeared as the hosts. Yet the visitors were another matter entirely. People had apparently come here repeatedly day after day, and yet many of the visitor records were blank. Some had visited Lord President Kayla and Lady Viridian twice. Their identities were absent. No names, no signatures, nothing. Lord Winters recalled an old family story about a supposed 7th chapter house, the House of Hemithia, which had allegedly been dissolved after some terrible scandal. Its children had been scattered among other chapters, and some had supposedly fled to the Sisterhood of Khan. The story had always sounded like old Gallifreyan legends. Standing inside this forgotten chamber, it suddenly seemed considerably less fictional. The room contained more questions than answers. There were empty display cases, where 4 objects had clearly once rested. Ancient flags hung throughout the chamber, but only 4 of the 6 chapter colours remained. A hologram showed what appeared to be a diplomatic meeting between Gallifreyans and another species. Professor Canis and the investigator debated whether the alien figures might be Silurians or another race. Lord President Chronotis wondered if the missing species might somehow be connected to the strange events surrounding the room. Then Lord Darkfire offered a darker possibility. What if the missing visitors had not simply disappeared? What if they had been erased from history itself? If someone had been removed from the timeline, perhaps their name could vanish from records. Their existence could disappear from databases, their presence could be erased from memory. Professor Canis took the theory further. If Gallifrey had once formed an accord with another species, and that species had later on been removed from time, their records might have disappeared while the Gallifreyan side remained. It would explain the incomplete visitor registry, and it might even explain the strange half-Gallifreyan seals. Lord Winters then revealed the darkest part of the old Hemithian legend. His cousin had claimed the chapter house might have been accused of sharing Gallifreyan secrets with aliens. If that were true, the chapter house could have been deliberately expunged from the Matrix and from history itself. Lord Serpentine suggested another possibility. Perhaps an ancient council had attempted to form an alliance with a powerful race, only for the alliance to become something far more sinister. Perhaps coordinates had been obtained under the promise of diplomacy, only for a temporal trap to be created instead. Nobody could say which theory was correct. Every answer seemed to create another question. The room itself became the greatest mystery of all. The clocks remained frozen, the tea remained warm, the flour had not decayed, the dust seemed ancient and yet somehow newly arrived. Professor Canis suggested that the people who once occupied the room might have become the dust itself, perhaps the victims of some temporal weapon. Lord President Chronotis wondered if the entire chamber had been frozen at the exact moment after the occupants disappeared. Lord Darkfire considered concealment, wondering whether someone had deliberately altered records, memories, physical evidence, and even history itself. Lady Chronotis began writing everything down, determined that the room would have to be properly documented and archived. Lord President Chronotis stepped onto one of the seals and heard an audible click. The seal was a pressure plate. The investigator quickly moved to the matching seal across the floor for another click. For a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, then a star map activated across the floor. Constellations appeared before them, vast and ancient, but one constellation had been deliberately scratched away. Not merely obscured, not damaged by age, scratched away, erased. Professor Canis immediately recognized the significance. If the stars had been removed from the map, what existed in the space where those stars once belonged? Lord Serpentine wondered if the map might depict ancient Gallifreyan colonies or even one of the false Gallifreys created to deceive enemies. Lady Chronotis stared at the missing constellation and quietly recognized that everyone else was beginning to understand. Something had been deliberately removed from history, perhaps a place, perhaps a people, perhaps an entire species. Professor Canis began calculating the position of the missing constellation, attempting to determine the region of space and the approximate period represented by the map. The stars were not where they should have been relative to their present position. Stellar drift could provide a rough estimate. Lord Winters pointed out that old Gallifreyan TARDIS keys even contained miniature constellation maps that might help. After Lord Serpentine's TARDIS summoned him away, Professor Canis continued his calculations. Eventually, he reached a startling conclusion. The map represented a point in time approximately 8 to 12,000 years in the past. Ancient by any reasonable measure, but perhaps not ancient enough to explain everything they had witnessed. And still, the questions remain. Lady Chronotis looked around the chamber and wondered aloud whether there could be any more beyond the room. Why would anyone need a visitor badge for a single chamber? Why was the surrounding area so elaborate? Lord Darkfire noticed that the rock face itself might not have always been there. Lord Conundrum wondered whether the room had simply been unfinished. Lord President Chronotis agreed that more excavation was necessary. The group had found too many contradictions to simply walk away. The decision was made to treat the chamber as an archaeological site and potentially even a crime scene. Everything would be documented before anything was disturbed. Samples would be collected. The dust would be analysed. Star coordinates would be compared against matrix records, and the missing constellation would be investigated to determine whether it had once existed, and perhaps most disturbingly, whether it had been removed from reality itself. Lord Darkfire suggested that access to the area should be restricted while the investigation continued. Lord President Chronotis agreed, and Lady Chronotis ordered that a team return to gather samples and document the chamber properly. Even the dust, strange as it was, might hold evidence. But just before they departed, Lord Winters offered one final theory. Perhaps the room had not just been in stasis at all, and perhaps it had been removed from normal time, existing outside the ordinary flow of history, and only recently returned. The cave dust and the rocks may have entered the room when it was brought back into phase, like the old Earth legend of Brigadoon. The chamber may have vanished from normal time and then simply returned. That was true, and the chamber had not merely survived thousands of years, it had been waiting, and now it was back. The group prepared to leave, with Professor Canis taking the star chart calculations for further investigation, and Lord Winters volunteering to examine whether the cave workers had accidentally disturbed some temporal conduit. Lord Darkfire departed with a final farewell to the lords and ladies present. Lord Conundrum followed soon after, while the remaining investigators prepared to begin the next stage of the mystery. Lady Chronotis looked down at her ruined shoes. They had been worth sacrificing, because beneath the caves of Gallifrey they had discovered something that should not exist, a place untouched by decay, a history filled with missing names, a diplomatic accord with an unknown race, 4 vanished objects, ancient seals, and a photograph that should not exist, and a constellation deliberately scratched from the heavens. Somewhere in the darkness beyond that chamber something had been erased. And the deeper they dug, the more it seemed that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make sure Gallifrey would never remember what it was.